it's 7 o'clock, your time, back home.
Yes.
Dear Lord. You don't get up this early every Monday? I'm semi-retired, so I don't anymore, but I got to more for you, I guarantee you. We were just saying in the hall, there's no place we'd rather be this morning than you. This is just delightful. My name is Mike, and I'm from Birmingham, and even though we live a long way apart, I feel very close to you. I'm glad to get to meet you, Professor.
I'm Sarah Kirk, and I'm a professor emeritus from a state college in Nebraska.
Good morning, my name is Barry Anderson. I'm an associate justice on the Minnesota Supreme Court.
They have given us these microphones for no apparent reason. All three of us project pretty well, and I bet you do, so if I could figure how to turn this off. Janae, do you know how to turn this off?
It's like there's a button on the top, you can press it up.
Now, if y'all are recording, and if you can't hear us in the back, we will turn it back on, but we don't need it, we don't think, and if you can hear us, we're gonna rock and roll. Yeah.
We can't hear you back there.
You can't? All right, we'll talk louder. We'll turn it, go ahead and turn it on if you want to, whatever we need to do. Especially because they may be recording.
Yeah.
Well, I turned it the other way on purpose.
Unless it's a newfangled mic, I don't know.
After bragging that we
Newfangled.
didn't need it, then we might. Tell us
All
who you are and introduce your teacher if you have one, or did you teach yourself?
Well, hello, we're Unit 4 from Grant High School in Portland, Oregon. My name is Aiden Vogt.
My name is Eva Pitzer.
I'm Oliver Siemens.
My name is Paige Axness. This is our teacher, Miss DePascal. Thank you for your time. We are very excited to be here.
We're delighted to have you. As bright as you are, I guess I don't need to tell you that we're doing question number 1, since you've done the other 2 for the last few days. But because you're recording and so your family and friends can know where you're taking us, this one's a lot shorter than the question 2 yesterday was 9 pages long. A little shorter. Let's read quick. Legislative power in Congress changed significantly from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution. Why do you think the framers felt it necessary and are proper to add the necessary and proper clause? How has Congress used this constitutional power in legislation, and how have the courts impacted the power? How does the listing of enumerated powers affect the impactfulness of the concept of implied powers? And if you can do that in 4 minutes, bless your keeping it hard. Ready to go? Take over.
Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government had very little power. Congress couldn't directly tax the people or regulate interstate commerce. And critically, Article 2 stated that Congress couldn't do anything unless it was expressly delegated in the Articles of Confederation. While the Articles served their purpose during the Revolutionary War, once it was over, their glaring flaws could no longer be overlooked. The ensuing Constitutional Convention was tasked with fixing these flaws, and their discussions surrounded a central question: how much power should be given to the federal government? Anti-federalists, like Charles Pinckney, were proponents of a pro-states' rights South Carolina plan, which, similar to the Articles of Confederation, would deny the federal government all powers except those expressly enumerated in the Constitution. On the other side of the debate was Alexander Hamilton, who proposed a plan that would give the federal government the power to make any law, only being limited by the presidential veto.
Among this discourse, Edmund Randolph proposed Resolution 6 of the Virginia Plan, granting the federal government power to legislate in all areas where the states are incompetent. This plan was sent to the Committee of Detail and modified to include all powers outlined in Article 1, Section 8, followed by the necessary and proper clause. However, no notes detail why the committee ultimately decided on this structure. In interpreting the clause, Joseph Story said, "It is not a grant of any new power to Congress, but merely a declaration for the removal of all uncertainty." However, in practice, it is not a removal of all uncertainty, leaving interpretation up to the courts. In McCulloch v. Maryland, the Supreme Court said, Congress does have the power to charter a bank, a power not enumerated in the Constitution. Recognizing the necessary and proper clause, the court said, let the end be legitimate within the scope of the Constitution, appropriate and consistent with the letter and spirit of the Constitution.
Since McCulloch, the necessary and proper clause has been the basis for nearly all of Congress's legislation, including using the Commerce Clause in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 to establish a national highway system, and using the powers in Article 3, Section 4 to create national parks. However, this clause does have its limits, as seen in Prince v. U.S., where the court struck down a congressional law requiring local law enforcement officers to perform background background checks on handgun purchasers because it required state officials to perform federal tasks. Another case, NFIB v. Sebelius, the court considered what the individual health insurance mandate, the Affordable Care Act, which they ruled was invalid under the Commerce Clause.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas believes that the listing of enumerated powers it reduces the efficacy of implied powers. Dissenting in U.S. v. Comstock, in our system, the federal government's powers are enumerated and hence limited. Yet others, like Justice Anthony Kennedy, who concurred with the majority, said, the analysis depends not on the number of links in the congressional power chain, but on the strength of the chain. That powers that can be logically linked back to an enumerated power are constitutional. Kennedy's opinion reflects Alexander Hamilton's view that it was the intent of the convention to give a liberal latitude to the exercise of specified powers. Additionally, Chief Justice John Marshall in McCulloch v. Maryland said, the degree of the necessity of legislative discretion, not of judicial cognizance, implying that the Supreme Court shouldn't rule on any of these issues in the first place. These historical and current disagreements show that the necessary and proper clause builds at its sole responsibility to remove uncertainty, leaving its existence in the Constitution arguably unnecessary and improper. Thank you. We are now ready for your questions.
Thank you very much. Aiden, Alexander Hamilton seemed to be on the opposite side of every debate. It seemed like whatever the debate was, but he at least did get a musical written for him. Professor, you want to take a moment?
I'll start with the question about how do you see the necessary and proper clause playing out in today's society in terms of, is it dual federalism, is it cooperative federalism, or has it become so confusing that one might call it conflicted federalism?
I would say it's become so confusing, specifically because the courts have started to dissect the word proper, which is not in the intention of the clause. It was merely there to bring attention to implied powers, in contrast to the Articles of Confederation. But the courts have started to dissect these words beyond what they were even intended to mean.
For example, in the case Prince v. U.S., the court considered that the congressional law that required local law enforcement officers to perform background checks on handgun purchasers, where they decided that it was unconstitutional because it violated the 10th Amendment, where Congress did not have the power to commandeer state officials and make them perform federal tasks.
It's important to remember that we are trying to find a connection between an enumerated power and the goal of this legislation. And instead of analyzing the necessary and proper, those exact words. And I think that gets very confused within legislation and within the Supreme Court.
And the court can essentially reach these same conclusions without needing the necessary and proper clause. It just creates a lot of confusion when they pick apart each word of the definition of purpose.
I want to follow up with the 10th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment says all powers not delegated. You brought up in your opening statement the comment of expressly delegated, and of course they wanted Madison to put that in the 10th Amendment, and he refused. Now, granted, there was a lot of debate going on there. But, so what's the difference between delegated and expressly delegated?
Well, under the Articles of Confederation, they had a very similar provision as to the 10th Amendment in Article 2, which said that the states retained all rights not expressly delegated to the Congress. And this effectively meant that only the enumerated powers were reserved for the federal government, and everything else was up to the states. And that came up with many problems with the federal government being unable to do a lot of crucial things.
Exactly.
And so when the Constitutional Convention was discussing the same issue, they explicitly removed the word expressly to allow for the implied powers to exist under the Constitution.
Yes, not including the word expressly in the 10th Amendment leaves room for the implied powers and future-proofs the Constitution in ways that the founders couldn't have imagined.
For example, we need to have that authority to continue to progress in society. The founders could have never imagined what is going on today in society. They can't imagine social media or anything related to technological improvements or progression. Therefore, we needed that space in the Constitution to continue to progress in society.
Yeah, and Federalist 44, Madison said that without the substance of these powers, the Constitution would be a dead letter. So essentially, we need those implied powers in order to progress.
As a practical matter, have we arrived at a place where there are essentially no limitations on the necessary and proper clause? We do do have some cases that you mentioned where the courts have said you can't go here, or you can't go there. But the reality is, the federal government is heavily involved in education, healthcare, lots of things that have traditionally been seen as local interests. As a practical matter, what checks are there on the necessary and proper clause?
Well, in U.S. v. Morrison, the court decided to strike down provisions of the Violence Against Women Act because they couldn't relate it to the Commerce Clause. However, I believe that this was wrongly decided because there is implications of commerce within that case, or within that legislation, because women may be spending extra money on therapy or like security guards, that type of thing. So it's important to remember that the Congress does have those checks, but they also have legislation outside of that.
Similarly, the Supreme Court sort of checked Congress in U.S. v. Lopez, where they said that Congress could not, it was not an appropriate means of, regulating safety at schools through the Gun-Free School Zones Act, and held that that was not constitutional through the Commerce Clause, which was the end of the means end.
The framework provided by Chief Justice John Marshall in McCulloch v. Maryland of let the ends be legitimate within the scope of the Constitution, appropriate and timely adapted to that end, I believe provides a check on the necessary and proper clauses. It provides a framework or a doctrine for the Supreme Court to interpret to make sure that Congress does have the power to exercise their enumerated powers.
However, even the framers, like James Madison wrote in a letter to Spencer Rowan after the decision of McCulloch v. Maryland that he was concerned with how much power this gave Congress. He said that the decision gave Congress unlimited discretion as to how they could enact their enumerated powers.
However, the other side of it, McCulloch v. Maryland said that it should not be left to judicial cognizance, and therefore the Supreme Court does not have as much authority to check the legislative branch.
What about non-judicial ways of checking congressional power under the necessary and proper clause? Are there any non-judicial ways to do that?
Like, I think sometimes the executive has some discretion over this. The example I think of is the Controlled Substance Act, which federally banned marijuana. However, a lot of times the executive chooses not to enforce this and uses their prosecutorial discretion to allow for states to decide it on their own.
The executive also has the power to veto bills as established in Article 1, Section 7.
Go.
One of the most fundamental promises this remarkable document gives me and gives you is the promise of equal protection. The law of equal protection is said over and over. We use that phrase over and over. But if my state has the power to restrict my voting rights more than Oregon's are, if Georgia leaders have the power to limit a woman's right to privacy in Georgia compared to another state, and we can make a list as long as you want. Does this clause notwithstanding, does giving that much power over that many personal things to the state make the promise of equal protection under the law the Constitution gives me a hollow promise?
I think it can be, and I think something worth bringing attention to is that the original wording of Resolution 6 of the Virginia Plan was that Congress should step in when the states are incompetent. And of course, that's very vague.
They would spend a lifetime in Alabama.
Afterwards, it says when the states are incompetent or when the unity of the United States would be in jeopardy. I believe an example like this of differing rights, drastically different legislation between the states is an example of when the United States unity is under threat. And since the Committee of Detail isn't tasked with changing the meaning of the words that they were delegated with, it's safe to assume that what they resulted with, the enumeration followed by the necessary and proper clause, likely had a similar meaning to what they were given in Resolution 6.
Yeah, I think it can create fear in people when there's instability within the government. When there's a national problem, people look for national solutions.
I believe that one of the ways that Congress should be able to fix this is through passing legislation bipartisanly. But right now, because of the political polarization and the gridlock we see in Congress, it is almost impossible to get bills passed through.
So are you at a point where you think that more things should be standardized across the United States, from state to state? Speed limits. I mean, think of all the things, the hours that the polls are open, whether you vote by mail or you have to show up at a polling place. I mean, how far are we going to go national government, through necessary and proper, dictate that everything is done.
Well, I do think that having more standards in place increases equity within the United States. For example, it will not allow as many polls to be disrupted, and it will allow more people to be able to vote. Like discriminated groups will be able to vote. And I also believe that things like interstate commerce need to have some regulations because it is something that affects the whole federal government and the whole United States.
I would also say that a lot of the reservations we have for state sovereignty is really a product of the time that the Constitution was ratified. Since at the time, the states had more sway over personal identification than the national government did. People identified with their states much more strongly than they do today, largely because of increases in technology. Communication's quicker, people can move so much faster that being confined to your state isn't much of a necessity as much anymore. So having more standards between them makes more sense, since there's less difference between the states than there were at the time of their ratification.
Let me push back a little bit on that. The principles of federalism are potentially, I think, impacted by a broad understanding of the necessary and proper clause. There are something like 3,000 counties in the United States, 50 state jurisdictions. Is it even possible to standardize everything? And shouldn't we be restricting the necessary and proper clause to leave space for our federalism process to unfold?
I would say yes, there are clearly things that should be left to the states. I think that the line should be drawn as when problems can cross state lines easily. An example I think of is like gun regulation. Guns can cross through state lines. Immigration policy, immigrants can cross through state lines. When there's a clear possibility that legislation in one state will affect the other states, I think that is a scenario where standardization on the national level makes sense.
An example of what you're talking about is U.S. v. Lopez, where the court struck down the Gun-Free School Zones Act. They said that the federal government didn't have the power to mandate gun-free school zones under the Commerce Clause, but that power is still left up to local jurisdictions currently.
So Nate, how much time do we have left? I want to ruminate over that. How true that is. 15 seconds. This is where the federalism acts at its best. The federal table over here gets to tell the state of Oregon what a good job. For those of you in the back, there were 15 seconds left, and with this panel right here, that ain't fair. I couldn't ask them. Happy birthday in 15, could all have something to contribute. Professor, what's your name?
Yeah, just a few comments. I love that you brought up Resolution 6 of the Virginia Plan, kind of the historical aspect. I love the discussion about expressly delegated versus delegated. You brought up some court cases that I thought you would. I was pleased with that. McCullough, Prince, Sebelius, etc., Morrison, Lopez, particularly John Marshall. You brought up the national parks. I loved all that. So I thought your presentation was good. It was really balanced. You were articulate. You were concise. I would just have to say that you have kind of recalibrated my hope for the future, and I wish I could clone you all.
Sorry, I've already claimed them for Alabama. Great night. Jeff?
Thanks. So I enjoyed the conversation. This problem really intersects, there's an intersection between the commerce power and an intersection between the necessary and proper clause, and you really pick up on how they play off of each other in a way that I think shows a pretty high level of sophistication. I really like the response. I took a strong position. You came back at me with Lopez and said, look what happened here. I mean, they did actually establish a barrier. I think when I asked the question about where going with possible limitations on this power, you came back with the executive piece, which I think is absolutely correct. There is some interbranch stress on this. I think there could also be an argument for non-judicial means like upholding the banner of federalism and a political argument that the federal government is in fact exercising too much power under this clause. It was interesting, the exchange that we had about that issue, and the response that came back to me was about the Violence Against Women Act, which it really does raise some of these issues about, can you do this effectively at the federal level? So anyway, much more could be said about that, I'm not going to say it here. I thought it was a really good exchange, and, this is an argument we've been having since what, Wickard,
That's right.
and the grain, I mean, it still remains a live issue today.
Boy, doesn't it ever, I was thinking while you were talking, Judge, that how you feel about powers given to the states depends a great deal on which state you live in, as far as how that impacts your life. You've heard my voice enough today, you know what a good job you did. There's I don't get to say this in the argument room very often because it's so obvious, but let me say it today. There's an old proverb that the greatest gift a person can receive in life is the gift of a good teacher. And to say that you have a good teacher is the understatement of all time. Nice job.